Hey guys, David here and welcome to another Dark Art Guitars video. Today we're gonna build a new shape for me. I'm calling it the Vanquisher, and it's kind of my take on a comfortable but still very mean looking V-style guitar. Now it is going to be a headless guitar like my other ones, and it will be very small compared to most other Vs out there. This will make it very comfortable for playing seated, but also standing up, and should be kind of something different to most of the other ones that are out there. Now I'm gonna narrate this entire build here, but if you don't care about or hearing about all the details and you prefer to just sit back, relax and watch, feel free to mute this video, put on some music. I will not take it against you. Now the first step, as always, is preparing the wood stocks, and here I'm cutting some strips from wenge as well as maple, and these will make up the neck blank. I like using these multi-laminate necks, not because they are necessarily much stronger than just a single quarter-tone piece of wood, but I really like the look of it, and it kind of gives me some more creative freedom in the stylings without involving a lot of paint. You can also see that I'm building here two guitars at the same time. You've already probably seen the other build. It went really well here on the channel. It's the Blue Rain guitar, and you will see some steps where I have both here, but I will of course focus on this Vanquisher build here now in this video. After cutting the strips on the bandsaw, I'm just using my drum sander here to get them nicely parallel with some smooth gluing surfaces, and that's just a really quick way to do it. I've done it on the CNC before to just kind of use it as a jointer, but with the drum sander it's a lot easier, and this process is actually quite quick, and it doesn't take much time at all to build these multi-laminate necks. Off camera I also prepared the body blanks, and this is going to be some swamp ash for this one here, and just glued together a couple of blanks, jointed them with my hand plane and glued them up, nothing too fancy. Then it's time to move on to the CNCing, and this is the last build I did here on my Rattrick Killer Bee. If you want to see more about the CNC, I have a whole build series where I go into much depth about building it and upgrading it. But now I'm actually building a new CNC, so this is no longer in my workshop, and you might have seen some of that as well. Now, the way I'll approach the CNCing is that I, well, of course, have to machine from both sides. So first I add some kind of locating holes. These I will later drill into the table as well, and that gives me a way to reference and make sure that when I flip it, everything stays nicely aligned. Then when cutting out these kind of outlines, I'm only going about halfway down. And another thing I'm doing is I'm not just cutting once around, but I'm actually doing like a little bit of an offset by doing roughing passes instead of Fusion 360. And this just gives the chips a lot more space to evacuate. It means I don't get a clogged up hole, and everything runs a lot smoother and will leave a better finish as well. Now I am still leaving like 0.2 or 0.3 millimeters on these sidewalls here, and then once I flip it over I will finish it all from the same side. This way I don't not get any kind of small seam where the two sides align. I also machine in the bevels first by just cutting them roughly out with some adaptive strategies, and then coming back in with a ball end mill to get everything nicely shaped. I also kind of pre-shape the heel here, but later I will go back in by hand and refine that. To hold the material down to the work surface, I am just using masking tape and super glue trick. This actually works really well. If you just need to make sure that you don't just put the masking tape on there, but really burnish it down, apply some pressure, and then just use some medium super glue to attach the two sticks together. And I haven't really had any issues of it flying off with big pieces like this. For the neck, I'm using much of the same strategies. First, machining in the slots for the truss rod as well as for some carbon fiber reinforcements, and then flipping it over with the same locating trick and machining the outline as well as kind of roughing out the shape, and then using a ball end mill to mostly finish shaping the neck. I will go in ever so slightly and refine it once the fretboard is glued on to make sure it feels nice, but the vast majority of the material I'm able to remove with the CNC, and that saves me just a lot of time. Now, I do get comments every once in a while that using a CNC is so much faster, and by hand is kind of the true way of doing it. And if you think the CNC is faster for building like a one-off build, it's actually very much not. Now, you might not be chiseling there or rasping for as long, but the entire design process and getting all the tool paths to be perfect and everything set up in the machine, in the end, it takes just as long to machine this neck here on the CNC. Now, the benefit is when I'm making the next guitar, I already have all of that design work done, and I can more easily do it this way, and I also get a bit more accuracy. But that is very much a trade-off on how you like to work and kind of how much new stuff you do every time. And the last major thing to do on the CNC is cutting out the fretboard, as well as some of the inlays. I'm trying out a new kind of cross style inlay here, which I'm then filling in with epoxy. And that is just another operation that is really easy on the CNC. You could do this by hand, but that would take a lot more effort. And here, I'm pretty sure it does actually save a lot of time. If you're just doing dot inlays, that works perfectly well by hand, but more complicated stuff like this is really quite fun on the CNC. And then use this 1-inch ball and mill to radius the top of the fretboard. I'm just doing a 16-inch radius, nothing compound here. That's what I like for my guitars, and I think it looks quite nice as well. Cutting the fret slots with a tiny 0.6mm end mill might seem scary, and I sometimes get comments about how many times I break this tool, but it's actually quite fine. Once you get your strategy nailed down, I basically never break tools in the cut. Now, I've broken more than one by accidentally brushing against it with my hands while installing it, but that is much on me. This operation here takes probably about half an hour to cut all of these fret slots, which is definitely slower than if you cut them with a saw, but it means I can have them directly hidden without having to bind the fretboard. To glue on the fretboard as well as in the carbon fiber reinforcements, here I'm using epoxy. And the main reason why I'm using epoxy to glue on the fretboard instead of wood glue is because I'm using Richlite as the fretboard material. And it's a composite from kind of resin-infused recycled paper. So while I've heard some reports that Type-on wood glue sticks to it quite well, I didn't want to risk it, so I just use epoxy, as I know that that will work well. I'd love to get into vacuum bagging to properly clamp down the fretboards, but here now I'm just using kind of a radius sanding dish to apply some pressure. But with the neck already cut, it's still not perfect, and sometimes I get a little bit of a gap on the sides because I just can't apply the right kind of pressure to the side of the neck because it's already shaped. I've tried doing it in a different order of operations where I glue on the fretboard first and then cut the neck, but it's just not as convenient for how I like to work. So this is the best way I've worked it out. Before assembling everything, I start with some rough sanding, just kind of getting some of the machining marks off and stuff aligned, but I will do much more sanding at a later stage. Here you can see me using that same radius sanding block to make sure that everything is nicely at the perfect radius as well as nice and straight. Now I do also use just my straight sanding block here every once in a while instead of the radius one, as I feel like it's a little bit more straight and I can more specifically target areas, but I go back and forth between the radius one and just a straight leveling beam to, in the end, get the finish that I need. I will then also afterwards go up the grids just by hand, like after roughly 320 or 400 grit, I don't use the leveling beam anymore as I'm taking off so little material that I can just do it by hand. But I then kind of like to go up to roughly 1000 grit for my fretboards, and that just doesn't quite get them up to fully glossy, shiny, but make sure that they are nice and smooth and have a little bit of sheen to them as well. Before I install the frets, I also apply a first coat of oil, and the reason why I do that, for one, it looks really cool, but also if I get some kind of super glue squeeze out or other dirt on it, it's a lot easier to clean off if it is already oiled, as it will not kind of seep into the material quite as much. Now I make sure that I only have a very small amount on my rag here, as I don't want it to get into the fret slots, as there I want the glue to stick properly. I then prepare the stainless steel Jescar frets that I'm installing here. This is the super jumbo ones, the very largest one they sell. And it is quite a bit of work to install these stainless steel frets, but in my opinion it's like no comparison to nickel silver. And every guitar I've built so far I've installed stainless steel frets. So to me it's just the way it goes. And I'm using here my arbor press with a clamping hole, installing it. And the first couple of threads, I'm using a feeler gauge to make sure that they are inserted all the way properly. And then once I install a couple of them correctly, I know the process, and then I just go forwards. A little trick that I started doing to get the ends flush more quickly on the stainless steel threads is actually using this edge sander. Now it tears up the paper quite fast and dulls it, but it just cuts down on the time that I need to do by hand to get them nicely beveled and all to the same length by a lot. Now I still go back by hand to get them to the very final size, as I don't trust myself on the belt sander enough to get them all perfect. But instead of having to spend 15 minutes by hand, I only have to spend a couple of minutes to just get it perfect. To get the threads perfectly leveled, I put some Sharpie marks on the top. That way I see which threads have been touched and which not, and then go back to the leveling beam. Here I'm just using the straight one and not the radius one, and that allows me to just go over everything nicely, make sure that all the threads are kissed. If I did a good job, then there's barely anything needed, but every once in a while I don't have a great day and there's a lot more needed. So after that, I need to re-crown the threads. Now, if I only kiss them very slightly, I'm just going to use my kind of fine triangular file to get that back in. But threads that have been taken a bit more off because either they were a bit thicker or didn't insert quite as much, I have this other like Hosco crowning file that is a bit coarser and can remove more material more quickly. It's really worth spending the time here on the fretwork, paying attention to every single thread, making sure the ends are nice, and then making sure that all the scratches are removed. I'm just moving up the grids with some sandpaper here. It goes fairly quick once you get the hang of it, but it's still a bit tedious and definitely hard on the fingers. Paying a lot of attention here, just make sure that in the end you have an instrument that plays really well, and you can set up the low action, and it will be so much more enjoyable and feel so much more premium if the fretwork is done well. That's an easy way you can set yourself apart, even as a beginner builder. It's about just putting in the time on the fretwork, and guitar with good fretwork, you're already half the way to a great guitar. And then the last step, you can also use a Dremel to polish them up, or since I have everything masked up, I'm just using this kind of bigger polishing wheel that I chuck up in the drill, use some polishing compound, and this makes really quick work of polishing up all the threads. Now you do want to be careful not to stay too long on it and overheat the threads. That can kind of loosen up the glue, and you can have a bad day this way. But if you're careful, kind of move back and forth a bit, then it should be fine. And you can clean off the residue with some alcohol, and you're done. All of your threads are installed and nice and shiny. Now, oftentimes for the side dots, I like to install lumen lay, but here I decided instead to have it match white inlay, as the lumen lay material is not quite as white as just white plastic. So here I'm just installing these white plastic rods, drilled the holes. Here you really want to make sure that you have a high quality drill bit. Having high quality brad point drill bit means that you will get little to no tear out, and you will get a very clean inlay. But if you get a bunch of tear out, then you have some spots to fill, and it's going to look ugly. And well, you just need to get that one drill bit size. So for me, it's 2.5 millimeters in a high quality, and you can use regular drill bits for everything else. Before I join the body on the neck, I am doing some more sanding. Some of the areas are easier to reach now before it is assembled. And in general, there is a lot of sanding. I'm showing just a small fraction here in this video, as well, it's about as boring as watching paint dry. But just know that while the CNC might speed up a lot of the kind of routing out and rough shaping, that's a small fraction of the actual guitar building process. All of the sanding by hand, as well as all the finishing, the CNC doesn't really help with. And that, in my case, is the much bigger fraction of the process. Here on the Vanquisher guitar, as well as on my Necromancer, the X-Type, I have a lot of sharp angles and flat surfaces, and these are actually surprisingly hard to sand. It is almost twice as easy to sand my Alchemist shape, which is all nicely rounded over, as I can just kind of go ham on the sanding, and with all the nicely rounded over corners, you can't really tell as much if something is not perfectly flat. Whereas here, with all these nice facets and angles, I really need to pay attention that I'm using flat sanding blocks and don't accidentally round over any of the corners. Another really tricky area to get is kind of the recurve where the tuner axis is, as it is completely concave there in 2 axes. And that just means that you can't really get in with any sort of sanding tools, and you have to do it by hand. And to make matters worse, it's in end grain, which is always a pain to sand. As a final step here, I'm using this red Scotch-Brite pad to just kind of deepen some of the grain lines. It has a bit of softness to it without being too coarse, and it gives you a little bit of that effect to pronounce the grain of the swamp ash. Now, if you wanted to do a lot more of the kind of super pronounced ash grain, you would use the sandblasting setup to kind of blast out the softer grain lines, but I didn't want to go too crazy with it, just a little subtle enhancement. So using the Scotch-Brite pad worked quite well. And it also just makes sure that the entire surface is nicely uniform. Then it is finally time to glue in the neck. And I do regularly get comments on why I glue in the neck, and if that is strong enough, wouldn't it be much more strong to use bolts instead? And in my opinion, well, bolts are not any stronger. It's just a lot more convenient to bolt on your neck. You can completely finish the body and the neck separately and just bolt them together in the end, and was kind of introduced, I believe, by Fender as a cost-saving measure in the factories. And believe me, I would save probably hours on my builds if I did bolt-on necks. But what you cannot do with a bolt-on neck is kind of super finely taper out the body joint and have almost a neck-through feel. So here, after I glue it in, I go back with this sanding drum. It's just a spindle sander drum that I put on a 3D printed manual, chuck it up in a drill, and now I can really go in and make a perfectly smooth transition, and well, what you get is so much more comfortable than any bolt-on neck could ever be. Then there is a lot more sanding the neck, sanding the rest of the body, fine sanding everything, hours and hours. It's a combination of using the random orbital sander, sometimes with a soft sanding pad on it, sometimes without, and a lot of hand sanding. I like to use these fabric-backed sandpapers as they are a lot sturdier, and I can kind of stretch them across the neck here and smooth out everything nicely. And then sometimes if I see some kind of edges that I need to take off or want to take off a bit more material in one spot, I will use a hard-backed piece of sandpaper and then go back to the softer one to smooth everything out in the end. This sanding steps here are another place where you really differentiate between kind of cheaply built guitar and a more higher end instrument, and it takes a lot of attention to detail to get out all the scratches, and oftentimes it'll look like it's perfect in the wood, and then you apply finish and you see you've missed a bunch of stuff. So applying some water to kind of pop out is one way. And here in this design, I'm also starting off by applying this black stain over everything. And this does two things. For one, it allows me to kind of darken the grain by sanding it away after, but it also highlights any sort of imperfections or any swirls that I didn't sand yet and pops the grain for me. And since I have to sand back the black anyhow, that just smooths everything out, and it's a win-win in all cases. I'm also not careful about missing the wenge or anything else here, just applying the stain to everything, and so I will sand it back later. And there's not really anything here on this guitar that I want to keep pristine. I'm going for much more of a kind of weathered red look here, so having a bit of unevenness is actually what I'm going for. To sand back, I'm starting off with the random orbital sander with a fairly fine sandpaper at the areas where I can reach it. And then, of course, there's a lot to do by hand for all of the edges where I don't want to round anything over, and that is all done by hand later. Inside of the cavities, like where the springs will go for the tremolo system, as well as where the bridge is, I'm consciously not really sanding much of it off, and that will just leave them darker or almost black, and give a kind of a nice contrast and blend into the background without standing out too much. You can see that I didn't paint the holes for the pickups, as I will later apply some shielding paint in there, which will also be black, so that's why I didn't bother putting any stain in there. Then finally it's time to put the red on, and this guitar really becomes alive. I'm using the stunning stains from Crimson here, and the red is the cherry red. The first coat I'm just using the cherry red over the black, and then later I go back in a second coat where I mixed a little bit of black into the red to just kind of get it a bit darker, not quite as bright, and that just makes for more of the color that I was going for. Then to shield the electronics cavity as well as the kind of the pickup cutouts, I'm using this shielding paint. That's one way to do it. Another one will be to use kind of copper or aluminum foil. I find the shielding paint more convenient, and it gives like nice black, simple background, and it actually works great. So there's no reason not to use it. And after done with the staining, it's time to clear coat. I'm using my kind of DIY spray booth here. It's really not perfect, but I don't have the space to set up a permanent one. So this is just kind of a shower curtain and then an exhaust with like a big exhaust fan on the bottom, and just making sure to wear all of the PPE, since I am spraying 2K polyurethane finish here, and those include some nasty chemicals in the hardener that you really do not want to breathe in. I am starting off with a fairly heavy coat here of actually gloss lacquer. Later it will be matte, but the gloss lacquer allows me to do much thicker coats, and I can just apply like 1 or 2 base coats, and that gives me the protective finish I need. And whereas if I was doing the matte coats, they have to go in a lot finer. I would have to do probably 5 or 6 of them, so I save a lot of time by going with the gloss here. I also spraying some other guitars at the same time where I need the gloss lacquer, so that also sped up the process. The way I'm holding them here, I'm just using some kind of pipes from the hardware store, and I have a Lazy Susan that I mounted to the ceiling that I can screw it in. That allows me to hold on to the guitars and be able to turn them around nicely so I can access all of the sides. After I sprayed on the gloss lacquer, I did go back and kind of sand everything nicely in flush. There's any sort of kind of raised sections, but this will still be an open pore finish. So all of the pores that we opened up, as well as the wingate pores, which are quite deep, they all are still present, but have just been slightly rounded over by the relatively heavy application of these first 2 coats. And then I sanded them flat again before applying just kind of a matte finish over top. However, it's not 100% fully matte. I added a little bit of the gloss in there, so it's more of a satin, but more on the matte side. It just kind of makes the color pop a little bit more, as with this Crop 2K polyurethane, the matte version of it is extremely matte, and you get almost no contrast and kind of saturation in the colors anymore. So going all the way matte, unless you're doing a matte black or something, it's almost a bit too flat for my taste. After removing the tape from the fretboard, I go back to the edges, and there of course now some paint is built up, so I just gonna make sure that everything is nicely rounded over and feels nice. There's no ugly spots. Sometimes a little bit of paint can get underneath the masking, so cleaning all of that up, and at this point I'm also rounding over the edges of the fretboard to make it more comfortable. I wait to do this until this point because I knew before already that I had to go back to sand anyhow, so this way I'm not doing this step twice. The pickups I'm installing here are the ones I wound in the recent video, so if you want to see how I made those, go back and watch that video. It's really cool. I had the bobbins 3D printed and then of course wound them myself. And to mount them into the guitar here, I'm marking the locations and I'm installing some threaded inserts, and this way I can much more easily take them in and out, and they are hard mounted in there, and but still very easily to remove. The hardware I'm using for this build is from Nova Guitar Parts. They make really affordable headless hardware that still is of decent quality. It costs probably about half of what sort of the higher end headless hardware costs, and but is probably 90% there with the quality. I use it on a lot of my builds, and I'm very happy with it. The way that the tremolo system works, it has kind of two bearings on either side, so it's not like a Floyd Rose where you have a knife edge that it is winding on, but with bearings, so similar to how a Strandberg would be working. But it is quite stable and very easy to adjust. For the electronics covers and as well as the jack cover, I installed some magnets and matching magnets in the covers that I made from some film maple. And that will mean that I can very easily attach it and there's no ugly screws that I have to hide. Since I'm hard mounting the pickups and I'm also installing some foams underneath, I prefer those over springs as I find that the pickups end up more stable while still being adjustable up and down to be able to get them at the right distance to the strings how you like it. Whereas if you were to just fully hard mount them, they would not be adjustable anymore. Drilling the holes for the claw of the tremolo system is one of those jobs where one of these old kind of egg beater style hand drills actually comes in really useful because it is extremely low profile. With my kind of cordless drill, there's absolutely no way I would be able to pre-drill those holes without having like a 30 centimeter long drill bit. But at the size that I would need to be able to pre-drill a hole, those don't really exist or will be way too floppy. I believe they do make drill extensions that would allow you for something similar, but I have this old hand drill and it is very convenient for this spot and goes quite quick as well. One of the last things I need to do is make the nut. And here I'm actually experimenting by using a Ridgelight nut as well, the same material I used for the Frettwork. Usually I go with the Graphtec Tusk, but I've heard from some other people having great success with Ridgelight, so I decided to try it out here as well, and it worked perfectly fine. It feels very similar to the Graphtec, although it is completely different material, but I think it will be just as good. For the spacing here, I'm using the compensated method of spacing it, and I just have this little spacing ruler from StuMac that allows me to get all of the locations dialed in. I just see what kind of fits, and this gives me the correct spacing between them that takes into consideration the thicker strings compared to the thinner ones, and make sure everything looks nice and even. I then used these Hosco nut slotting files to get them to the perfectly sized, and these files can be quite expensive if you're starting out, but they're really worth it, and you can't really make a good nut without a set of nut slotting files. For the headpieces, I'm using the single headpieces from Novar. They usually ship their bridges with kind of a block style headpiece, but I don't really like how it looks. It looks a bit too heavy and bulky in my opinion, especially with my kind of flared out headstock. So I much prefer using their single headpieces. They also have a very large screw. I believe it's an M5 screw that clamps down on the string, and that just allows you to tighten down a lot more, and they really hold your string securely even with just one bolt, whereas some of the other systems they might need two bolts because they're using a thinner one. Now these headpieces are wider than the string spacing, so either you would have to kind of turn every second 180 degrees, that's why they're tapered like this, or because I have a flared out headstock, I actually like the kind of slightly flared look that I will get from the strings here. This is also why they are kind of set back a little bit from the nut, and this allows the strings to separate and create a little bit of an actual headstock feeling without, well, being a headstock guitar. Stringing up the guitar here, in this case I'm using a set of 1056 strings because I plan on, at least for now, have it tuned to C standard for arch enemy tuning. But if you are buying this guitar, which by the way it is available for sale, then of course I can put on any set of strings you like and put it into any tuning that you like. So if you want E standard, I'd probably go for like a 942 set of strings. That is a bit softer, but since this is only 25 to 25.5 inch scale length, for the lower tuning such as C or C sharp, even D, the thicker strings will be a lot better, otherwise they will get too floppy. And with that, here we go. The first Vanquisher build is completed. I'm really happy with it came out. I really like the kind of dark weathered red color, and it fits, I believe, this shape beautifully. Speaking of playing, there will be a demo in just a second. Bear with me, I am feel like I'm a lot better guitar builder than I am a guitar player, and I should probably spend more time practicing. But, well, you should be enough to get a bit of an idea of what these pickups sound like. I also don't really have a great amp recording setup, so I'm just using my Hue & Kettner Tubemeister 18 amp on the high gain setting with the gain boost enabled. The microphone I'm using is not ideal for the recording. It's a Rode NTG2, and it is what I often use for the kind of voice recording. Not right now, I'm using my live to record this right now, but it is not meant for this, so it is also positioned quite far away from the speaker, so don't compare it with a properly mic'd kind of amp setup, but it should still give you an idea of somewhere between a room sound and a mic'd up speaker.